Hello friends, welcome to my channel. The Less is More. So today I will discuss an editorial from the Hindu, which is uh, which which was published on the day of the budget or the next day of the budget, because the topic of today's discussion is on the budget. So the title of the editorial is a budget that signals growth with stability. So let's start the discussion. The economic survey that was placed in Parliament before the presentation of the budget 2023-24 has laid emphasis on the point that India has staged a remarkable broad-based recovery to reach the level of income that existed before the outbreak of the novel coronavirus pandemic. So India has staged a remarkable broad-based recovery to reach the level of income that existed even before the outbreak of novel coronavirus. But there have been a series of shocks that began with the pandemic. Let's see which were the shocks. Followed by the war between Russia and Ukraine, accompanying sanctions that have been imposed by the West on Russia, slowdown and recession in major parts of the world, rise in inflation, leading to sharp increases in interest rates, followed by capital outflow and the pressure on the exchange rate. So these were the shocks that have been faced by the India. Still, the author is saying that the India has staged a remarkable broad-based recovery. Moving ahead, growth and the fiscal deficit shadow. Even though the economy has staged a recovery and surpassed the pre-pandemic income level, it is still 7% below the pre-pandemic GDP trend. Growth has to be fueled by increasing public investment. At the same time, with inflation still beyond the upper tolerance limit and aggregate fiscal deficit still in the range of 9 to 10% of GDP, ensuring macroeconomic stability requires what? Continued fiscal consolidation. So, as the author is saying, that country has surpassed the pre-pandemic income level, but the GDP trend is still at 7%, and the growth has to be fueled by what? Public investments. That means investment from the government side. But at the same time, what happened? With inflation still beyond the upper tolerance limit, aggregate fiscal deficit, that means combining of the center and states, still in the range of what? 9 to 10% of the GDP. So ensuring this macroeconomic stability requires what? Continued fiscal consolidation. That means we have to consolidate or reduce the fiscal deficit for consecutively 3 to 4 years, right? After that, this macroeconomic stability will be shown, will be seen. Thus, the government is faced with dilemma of accelerating growth by increasing public investment while containing the fiscal deficit. Government is facing the dilemma between accelerating growth with public investment while containing the what? Fiscal deficit. With interest payments accounting for 40% of the net revenues of the center, there is hardly any room for complacency. So interest payments account 40% of the net revenues of the center. So there is hardly any room for the government to spend on any other things, right? Interestingly, keeping the fiscal deficit limited to 6.4% of GDP in the current fiscal has come about. So keeping the fiscal deficit limited to 6.4% of GDP in the current fiscal has come about, that means happen, despite a sharp increase in food and fertilizer subsidies. So despite a food increase in food and fertilizer subsidy, the fiscal deficit limit of 6.4% of GDP has been achieved, while the higher than the while the higher than budgeted buoyancy in net tax revenues, almost 1.6 lakh crore, has helped. A significant part of the adjustment is due to an increase in the denominator, the nominal value of GDP, as compared to the assumption made in budget 2022-23. So how this fiscal deficit has been achieved? Because the buoyancy in the net tax revenues was higher in the last budget or the last financial year. It has helped in the adjustment, because what is this percentage suggest? Fiscal deficit to GDP, right, amounting rupees lakh crore. So denominator has been increased in the last financial year, uh, and that is nominal value of GDP. So author is saying that there is a increase in fertilizer and food subsidy. That means numerator is also increased, but GDP or the denominator is also increased more than what numerator is increased, right? So there has been adjustment. The budget estimated had assumed the nominal GDP for 2022-23 at 258 lakh crore, whereas the first advance estimate of GDP released few days ago estimated at 273 lakh crore. So budget had assumed 258 rupees lakh crore of nominal GDP, but what was in after that, after the completion of financial year 2022 and 23, it is at 273 lakh crore. In other words, despite the revenue deficit increasing in absolute terms from 9.9 lakh crore in budget estimate to 11.1 lakh crore in the revised estimate, as a percentage of GDP, it was from 3.8% to 4.1%. So this is the game of just numbers, right? There is two kind of estimate. One is budget estimate, and the again is second is revised estimate. Budget estimate has been presented at the time of budget, but revised estimate is presented during the next budget, right? So in the budget estimate there is the assumption, and in revised estimate there is the actual data of the GDP with the government, right? That we have assumed 9.9 lakh crore of what revenue deficit, but in the revised estimate it was 11.1 lakh crore. So revenue deficit has been increased, fiscal deficit is increased. In the case of fiscal deficit, the increase was by 1 lakh crore, from 16.6 lakh crore to 7.6 lakh crore, but it was contained at 6.4% of GDP, mainly due to the increase in nominal value of GDP and also the tax collection, as we have discussed just recently, right? So revenue deficit 3.8 to 4.1, and fiscal deficit remained at 6.4. Why? Because GDP and tax collection has been increased. A balancing act, what? Considering the challenges of increasing infrastructure spending while continuing with fiscal consolidation. It has been a fine balancing act on the part of the finance minister. She has continued the trend of making a greater allocation to infrastructure spending, and the capital expenditure is budgeted to increase from 2.7% of GDP to 3.3%. In absolute terms, the increase is from 7.3 lakh to 10 lakh crore, which is almost 37%. And considering that capital expenditure has significant crowding in effect, it should help to increase private capital expenditure as well. This comes after the 25% increase in the capital expenditure in the last budget. So, author is saying that here the finance minister has acted in a balanced way. How? Because she is emphasizing on infrastructure spending and continuing with the fiscal consolidation. So, since last 2 to 3 years, the Nirmala Sitharaman is emphasizing upon capital expenditure and trying to reduce the fiscal deficit. Means fiscal consolidation. So even in this so the capital expenditure has been increased from 2.7% of GDP to 3.3%, and in absolute term there is a rise of 37% from the last budget. So it will have, what is the significance of this? It will have crowding in effect, right? It should help in, and it will also help in increase private capital expenditure, right? Like if there is a bridge which is being built, right? So the workers will get income, and from that income the private consumption will be increased, right? The Reserve Bank of India has estimated the multiplier effect of capital expenditure at 1.2, and that should help revive the sagging investment climate. So RBI has also estimated multiplier effect of capital expenditure at 1.2, and it will help in reviving the sagging investment climate, which means reduce or the low level of commercial lending by banks is already on the rise with the deleveraged balance sheet, which means paying out debt by selling their own assets. Right, the increased capital spending should help revive the investment climate further and arrest the declining trend in the overall investment GDP ratio in the country. So, commercial lending is going on by the bank with its deleveraged balance sheet. So, this capital spending should arrest what declining trend in the overall investment GDP ratio. Further, the continuation of the interest-free loan to states to augment their capital expenditure should help in increasing states' capital expenditure as well. Perhaps the 6.5% growth rate for 23-24 estimated in the economic survey, which was otherwise considered too optimistic, could indeed materialize. So, this optimistic growth can be indeed materialized with budgeted increase in infrastructure spending. So, though the target is too optimistic, but RBI is saying that multiplier effect will be at 1.2. Then banks are also lending commercially, right? And there is a state interest-free loan to states. So the whole emphasis is giving upon on the capital expenditure side. So there is a high probability, or it is likely to increase the infrastructure spending, and it will propel the engine of our economy. The finance minister in the 2021 budget had stated that she would bring down the fiscal deficit to 4.5% by 25 26. That means that in the next 3 years the deficit will have to be reduced by 1.9 percentage points, right? So to achieve the target of 4.5% of fiscal deficit by 25-26, that means that in the next 3 years the deficit will have to be reduced by 1.9 points each year. In keeping with this, the fiscal deficit for 2023-24 is slated to come down to 5.9%. So for 23-24, it is slated to come down to 5.9%. However, it will make the adjustment in 2 years ahead that much harder. So this is harder than before the two. There is still there are 2 financial years before achieving the target of 4.5%. But it will make adjustment in 2 years ahead that much harder. So right now this adjustment will be much on the harder side. Although 9 states will have elections this year, front-loading the adjustment would have eased the situation next year when the country has the next general election. So author is saying that if we would have front-loaded the adjustment on this year only, so the situation for the next year would be much more on easier side, because on the next year there is a general election, right, that of Lok Sabha. Perhaps the finance minister assumed that by propelling growth this year through higher capital expenditure, the fiscal adjustment will become easier in the next 2 years. But the finance minister is thinking differently. What she is thinking that if I would increase capital expenditure on this year, so the effect or the multiplier effect it would have on the following 2 years. So in the following 2 years the fiscal adjustment would be much more easier, right? Compression in subsidies. The fiscal adjustment is proposed to be achieved by mainly containing revenue expenditure. How fiscal consolidation happens? By mostly containing revenue expenditure, because revenue expenditure does not create any asset or decrease any liability, which will improve the quality of public spending if it happens. The budgeted increase in revenue expenditure for 23-24 is just 1.2% higher than the revised estimate for the current year. So increase in the revenue expenditure is just 1.2% than revised estimate for the current year. There is a significant compression in subsidies. How? Fertilizer subsidies expect to be reduced by 90,000 crore from 2.87 to 1.87 lakh crore in fertilizer subsidy. The policy to this effect has already been made in December 2022 when the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, under which 5 kg of food grains were given from April 2020 in addition to the food grains given under the National Food Securities Act, has been discontinued. So in December 2020, the food that used to be given to poor or BPL families, almost 80 crore people were dependent on this. So these 5 kgs of extra food grains has been discontinued from December 2022. So it reduced the burden of subsidies on the government. Similarly, the fertilizer subsidy is expected to be compressed by 50,000 crore, mainly as fertilizer prices have come down. In addition, allocation to centrally sponsored scheme is expected to come down marginally by about 20,000 crore. So food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy would be reduced by 50,000 crore, and centrally sponsored scheme will also be, the allocation to this will also be down by 20,000 crore, and the overall current transfer to states is kept constant at 3.3 to 3.4%, and transfer to states, overall transfer to states has been kept at 3.3% to 3.5%. So here the government is highly cutting on the revenue expenditure. This is how the fiscal consolidation would be achieved, and it is necessary because the revenue expenditure does not create any asset or reduce any liability. It just increase the liability. On the tax side, there is some tinkering of custom duty. So custom duty would be increased. The overall protectionist stance has continued. So here government will have higher revenue from custom duties. On the personal income tax front, the attempt has been to incentivize taxpayers to move to the new tax regime with no concession and lower rate. So it would give a kind of certainty for the government to have a revenue. Right. Even so, the increase in the number of tax bracket it cause for worry. Perhaps it would have been preferable to move over to the new tax regime with fewer brackets. On the whole, this is a well-crafted budget, but its success will depend on its implementation. Right. So this was all about the budget, which signals what growth with stability. Growth may by spending on the infrastructure. So capital expenditure spending will be increased, and reducing what revenue expenditure. So and reducing fiscal deficit, reducing food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, centrally sponsored allocation to centrally sponsored scheme would be reduced. This is how the revenue expenditure will be reduced by the government. Okay, so this was the editorial for today. I hope you would have enjoyed it. Okay, bye bye. Good night. Signing off for the day. Bye.